Johnson. Mr. Mulvaney?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Johnson, just a couple of things. There's obviously a lot of different topics we could go over today, but I want to go over a couple small pieces of your testimony, and specifically, you advocate for strengthening the revenue base of the federal government, returning closer to the tax rates of the late 90s. This is in conjunction with the writing you've done regarding the expiration of the Bush-Obama tax cuts. I think you're right, by the way, to call them the Bush-Obama tax cuts. Not a lot of folks in this town do that, but you're absolutely right in that they were approved by this president in a Congress controlled by his party at the end of 2010. So I applaud at least the candor on that front. But the testimony you've got has a sentence that struck at me, which is that we need to strengthen the revenue base of the federal government, and then dash, 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 returning closer to the tax rates from the 1990s. Now, it strikes me those two things are not exactly the same thing. Are they? The base is the size of the economy or the number of people who are paying into the system, and the rates are what those people pay or what you charge against that size of the economy. Is that right? The base and the tax rate are really not the same thing, are they?
You're absolutely right. The base is the taxable base, that part of the economy which you feel you can tax, and the rates are what you're applying against that base.
And you put that together, and that's where you get your revenue. So let's talk about the base, because one of the things we've talked about in this committee in the past is the size of the base. And you're advocating for a return of the Bush-era, Bush-Obama tax cuts. Do you believe that will broaden the base?
Well, just increasing the rates in any tax system doesn't address the base issue. We also propose to eliminate or phase out a lot of so-called tax expenditures, which, as you know, are both on the individual tax side and on the corporate tax side, are part of what narrows the base. And when people talk about tax reform, they talk about doing both. We're in favor of tax reform, but we would rather have tax reform that raised revenue rather than being revenue neutral or in the context of revenue cutting. So that's the difference, pure and simple.
And there's something that we'll agree on in terms of ending the tax expenditures in an effort to broaden the base. One of the things that we hear regularly, gentlemen, is that there's roughly half the folks don't pay the income tax, and that as a result they don't pay for the operation of government. They may pay the payroll tax, which pays for their specific benefits, most notably Social Security and Medicare, but they don't actually pay for the running of the government. So I'll ask you, Dr. Johnson, a question I've asked a couple other people, which is, do you think that everybody should help pay for defense?
Absolutely, Congressman, and I believe that everybody does. Now, you're right, of course, that payroll tax is notionally marked as going to Social Security and going to Medicare. Those are, of course, very big government programs. 20% government spending is on Social Security, 15% arising is on Medicare. But people across the income spectrum pay lots of other taxes at the state, local, and federal level, including property tax and sales tax. This all contributes to the funding of the government.
Agreed. Let's stay, because it's come up before in previous hearings, and you've not been party to those, so I understand that you want to focus on a broader issue. But the issue we've talked about in this committee before is specifically defense, which is if I pay my local property taxes, I'm paying for schools, I'm paying for my local roads. If I pay my gasoline tax, I'm paying for roads. If I pay my state sales tax, I'm paying for everything that the state provides me. But defense is somewhat unique, isn't it? In that, tell me how everybody's paying for defense. Because it may be that I just don't see it.
Well, money is fungible, Congressman, and to the extent you're contributing to government and you're supporting all the activities of government across the different levels of government, state, local, and federal, I think anybody who's paying into that system, anybody who's paying any kind of tax, anybody who's participating in the modern taxed economy is helping to support government. So that we don't none of us pay a particular tax marked for defense, but even if we did, it'd be somewhat meaningless. Money is coming in, money is going out of the budget, and that's the overall balance which we need to take care of.
Sure, and obviously I agree with the concept that money is fungible, but I can assure you that the money that we pay to the state is not fungible for the money that the federal government uses to provide defense. Would you agree with me on that?
Well, a lot of the federal government spending is shared with or passed down to state level. So I think that while you're absolutely true that if the state decides to go off and spend an extra marginal $1, the federal government doesn't necessarily back that. A lot of funding, a lot of projects are actually joint. It's a great thing about the fiscal federal system that we've established and run for 200 years, and something the Europeans don't have and desperately need to have, exactly this kind of balance between the different levels of government and a shared funding and a shared burden of funding across all citizens, all tax-paying citizens. I think the American system has much to commend it around the world. Particularly, I commend it all the time to the Europeans.
Gotcha. And I don't mean to belabor the point, but there's been other folks. You're the first person to actually claim that everybody's paying for defense by virtue of the fact that they're paying the payroll tax or paying their property taxes or paying the gasoline taxes. They're actually, in effect, paying for defense. So I apologize for drawing that out. Maybe we can visit that another time. With the chairman's indulgence, can I continue for a few minutes? Okay, thank you. You've got a statement also in your testimony, Dr. Johnson, number 4, that says the idea, I'll read it, the idea that the recent increase in public debt is due primarily to runaway spending since 2008 is completely at odds with the historical record, although it is true that spending was not under control during the period 2000 to 2008. The worsening deficits since 2008 have been primarily due to a big drop in tax revenue and the sharp fall in GDP due to the finance-induced recession. And let me deal with a very quick credibility issue. So I'm hoping I don't get the answer that I think I just read, which is, are you saying that spending wasn't a problem in 2008 until now, but it was a problem from 2000 to 2008? Or not a driver of our deficits, maybe a synonym for problem?
Part of the problem from 2000 to 2008 was, part of what happened was 2 foreign wars, obviously that's spending, Medicare Part D, that's an addition to social insurance, that's spending, no matter how you look at it. The big hit since 2008 was a recession. Again, partly I'm quoting the Congressional Budget Office here, partly I'm quoting the IMF. The details are in the book chapter to which I refer there. I'm happy to send that to you. The point is, when you have an enormous recession caused by any financial sector blowing itself on the scale that we experienced, that blows a big hole in the tax revenue. You get some additional spending from unemployment insurance, which is a completely sensible social safety net you have in the event that, for example, your banks blow themselves up because they were reckless and took crazy risks. So that is a consequence of the financial crisis, and the fall in GDP, of course, means that even if you kept spending at the same level, it would look bigger relative to GDP, again, because the banks have blown such a big hole in your economy. So that's the specific sense in which I mean it, Congressman.
And I understand. You go on later in your testimony to, I think you quantified the Bush tax cuts' impact on the deficit in 2010 as being roughly $270 billion. You may not be aware that Mr. Van Hollen, the ranking member on budget, asked the CBO to quantify the effects of the recession on the 2010 deficit as well, and they placed it at roughly $370 billion, which gets us somewhere in the realm of $600 billion, which was half of the deficit. So can we at least agree that maybe half of the deficit is driven by a spending problem and not necessarily by GDP or the Bush tax cuts?
No, I'm afraid not, Congressman. If you have to look at the details of what the CBO said, I haven't had a chance to review that, but if you're saying the effect of the recession, a large part of the effect of the recession is precisely the loss of tax revenue. In fact, and this is not specific to the United States, across all developed countries with any kind of modern, sensibly functioning government, when you have a big recession, you lose revenues. In fact, in many countries, this is referred to as the automatic stabilizers and regarded as not a bad thing, it's a good thing. From a point of view of thinking about the tax burden on the economy, it automatically falls when you go into recession. Therefore, it helps to buffer the losses.
Oh, but now you're being Keynesian. You said you
well, I know that people feel strongly about Keynesian and not. I'm not particularly a Keynesian on much of this analysis, I have to tell you. But the view that there is an automatic stabilizer in the sense that you tax less in a recession and tax more, relatively speaking, in a boom, that's actually a reasonable notion. The Keynesian issue is, can you stimulate the economy? Can you micromanage the economy, particularly using fiscal policy? On that, I have deep reservations. Fiscal policy, as the Chairman said at the beginning, is for the medium run. Fiscal sustainability to support growth. That's the right approach to fiscal policy.
Dr. Johnson, I respect your position. I just look at the numbers and I look at the growth in spending, the top-line spending, and I recognize that the recession will have an impact on the receipts of the government and thus an impact on the deficits of the government. But if you look at spending in nominal terms, I haven't had a chance to do the math and convert it, but you're talking about a government that's grown on a nominal basis by 100% in the last decade. In fact, it grew 20% in just the 2009 fiscal year by itself. The expenditures of the government in 2000 were $1.78 trillion, and they're going to be roughly $3.8 trillion this year, so more than 100% over the course of the last 12 years. So I hear what you're saying, and I cannot but agree that part of the problem would come from the GDP, and certainly if you lower taxes and bring in less money, that may contribute in a short term to the deficit. But to say it's not a spending problem, I think, undermines the overall argument. But let me get the last issue to everybody, because the one thing we've not heard about today is productivity. And I think one of the lessons that we can learn from Europe is that they've been fairly locked into low productivity rates for a long time. It may be contributing to their structural deficits and the issues they're dealing with. They're probably not solving their productivity problem, even if there are countries that are making steps to solve their fiscal problem. Productivity is still not particularly healthy in Europe. We had a little boost here during the early stages of the 2008 recession, but in the long term, I don't think we're seeing any dramatic increases in productivity. In fact, the chairman mentioned about more folks leaving the workforce at 62, which generally speaking would be a time of their lives when they would be productive members of society. Now they're turning into retirement ages. So tell me, gentlemen, am I right to be focusing on this number one? And then if I am, tell me, and I'm specifically looking at Dr. Johnson now, tell me, and we'll ask to him, tell me how raising taxes is going to increase our productivity. Dr. Rogerson?
Well, I'll say for starters, I think you're right on base to say that productivity growth is absolutely essential to the long-term health of the economy. I think there's widespread agreement that productivity growth lies behind the sustained improvements in living standards. So absolutely, we need to be focused on policies that influence productivity growth and thinking about what policies are good for productivity growth. Having said that, I certainly do not think that raising taxes are good for productivity growth. I would.
Is that a gut feeling, Dr. Rogerson, or can you back that up?
I know of no evidence to have supported that. I mean, I'll temper it on the other side that I do not think that all taxes need be bad for productivity growth. I think some taxes might be relatively neutral in terms of productivity growth. If you think that a major source of productivity growth is the incentives to innovate, many tax policies may not be of first order importance in terms of the incentives for innovation, for example. But taxes on progressive taxes on labor income, for example, the more productive you become, the higher tax rate you pay. That obviously can provide a disincentive for people to accumulate skills, which would be a negative factor for productivity. So I think productivity is absolutely important. Taxes, certainly some taxes I believe can have important negative effects on productivity, but I would not go so far as to say all taxes are negative for productivity.
Dr. Biggs?
When I think about the EU, I mean, it's not that a French or German worker is necessarily less productive than an American worker for each hour that they work. They're skilled people and they're good at what they do. The issue is that they're simply not working the same sorts of hours that American workers are doing, and the question is why. I think Professor Rogerson's research provides compelling evidence that one reason why they work so many fewer hours is that the tax rates are a lot higher today than they had been in the past. So, and that obviously does, it leads to issues in terms of skills accumulation, because if you know you're going to be working more hours over the course of a year or having a longer career, building up human capital provides a larger payoff to you. In addition, when you have individuals who are shut out of the labor market for a long period, as you've had in Europe for quite some time, but unfortunately as we're increasingly having here, their skills deteriorate, their connection to the workforce becomes more tenuous, and so even when they do get back to work, that's when their productivity suffers, when their output per hour worked actually will fall. So I think there is a connection, and I think the fact that Americans work 100 hours or so more a year than many Europeans, I think that is not disconnected from tax rates. I'll say that.
And finally, Dr. Johnson.
I have three responses, Congressman. First of all, I'm not proposing anything close to European tax rates. No one has been a more outspoken critic of the European fiscal system and to your other interest, Mr. Brady, the monetary system than I have. I've written extensively about this. It's a disaster. And we don't want to go there, and I don't think we are going to go there. I don't think that's what we're talking about. Secondly, on labor market participation, Dr. Biggs has already given you exactly the right answer, which is if people start to fear that Social Security will not be there, then they will retire earlier. That was his point about retiring at 62 because you don't think the pension is going to be there. People have to believe that the system is going to continue in order for older Americans to remain working. We should be increasing labor force participation, including through people working and hours that they work, including these older Americans who have very valuable skills that we need to stay engaged with the labor force. The third answer is, to Professor Rogerson's point, we should be taxing consumption more and income less. And I've testified, I think not before this committee, but before a number of other congressional committees, on the advantages of a value-added tax of some form. That, to your point about productivity, is a very good way to address your concerns. That if you think we're taxing income too high, if we can agree on the role of government and how to fund it, we should be funding it more with taxes on consumption and less with taxes on income. It would address exactly your concerns. But I understand there is a bipartisan hesitancy to move towards a VAT, despite the fact that there are only 2 G20 countries that don't have a VAT, us and Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia doesn't have a shortage of revenue.
Thank you very much, and I especially appreciate the indulgence by my chairman for the extra time.